We are moving on to a new section in James, which I will now read. And I will go back to verse 12 and include that in the reading. We're going to look at verses 12 through 18, and I'll read those now. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Verse 12 acts as something like a bridge. We've noted this several times as James jumps from topic to topic or section to section. Sometimes he likes to put often a verbal link between the sections. Sometimes it's kind of weak and sometimes it's rather strong. In this case, it's a fairly strong one. And the link in between verses, the previous section we've looked at, all that we've looked at so far, and where he's moving, is the idea of testing, of trials. We noted last time that verse 12 serves as a bookend, right, to verses 2 and 3, where he talks about being steadfast under trials, and he revisits that in verse number 12. And then after 12, when we go to 13, he continues the idea of tempting and trials, but he's made a shift when he gets to 13. So once again, the link is what James refers to as trials and testing. And he's using a particular word for all of this. The word is, the root, the noun is para. So in verse number 2, he will say, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. Right there, he's using the word for trials of various kinds. Trials is perasmos, right? When you get down to verse number 12, when he says, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, trial there is perasmon. And then when you get to 13, let no one say when he is tempted, that he is being tempted by God. The word we use for tempt in both cases is from the same word, perasmenon. So he's using the same word for trial in verse 2 and 12 as he's using in verse 13 for being tempted. Now, I sent out an article earlier this week by another priest in our diocese looking at this passage, and he is of the opinion that the English word we use translated shouldn't be switched from trial to temptation. We should be looking at all of this as temptation, because James is using the same word. We in English should be using the same word to translate his. I disagree with that, and as do a number of commentators. Para can mean two different things. It can mean an inner trial, usually pointing to a struggle against sin, the temptation to sin, or it can mean outer trials, the things we face during life, the hardships that we come across that are often not our own fault. I think in verse 2 and verse 12, James is pointing to the outer trials. I say this because in verse 2, he says, when you meet various kinds of trials, not just the inner, it can be the outer, it can be any kind of trial that you meet, that we remain steadfast going through them. James will revisit this idea when we get to the end of the book, and he'll talk about being steadfast as Job was steadfast. And Job wasn't really dealing with sin. He was dealing with the external trials of life. So I think James begins by talking about the external, and he's still talking about that when he gets to verse 12. And so we can just use translate the word trial here. When we get to verse 13, James is shifting. He's shifting his focus. He's beginning to look at a particular kind of trial. And he's used this verbal link to to the past passages using pera, this idea of trial, but it's a shift. He likes to play with words, James does, and I think he's doing that here. So when we get to 13, he's now saying, all right, we've talked about trials in general. Now I'm going to look at a particular kind of trial that we face, that of temptation, being tempted to sin. And so we're going to spend some time over the next few sessions looking at this passage. And we're going to see some of where temptation comes from, how temptation develops into sin, and the results that come from how we deal with temptations, and some aid in resisting temptations. So I just want to make a few observations today as almost a sort of introductory observations on the passage before we really dig in over the next few sessions. First is, in this passage, when James is dealing with temptation to sin, he is dealing with something that is universally applicable. We all face temptation, every one of us. So in a sense, we all need to listen up. We all need to pay attention to what James is saying. None of us are exempt from his teaching here. However, we all face different temptations. You and I are not tempted in the same way. The things I'm tempted to do, the way I'm tempted to sin, very likely is not going to be the same way that you're tempted. You may not be tempted to gossip, or you may not be tempted you're just not a jealous person in general. You don't covet. While you may be strongly tempted to be dishonest, where others tend not to be. And there'll be overlap, but all of our temptations tend to be different and unique to us. So as you're listening to James over these passages, picture in your mind your temptation. Not your friend's temptations, not your spouse's temptations, your own. Keep your temptations in your mind. If you don't know what they are, then you have a lot of work to do. Then you're just blind. They exist, and you need to spend time with God asking, what are my temptations to sin? Where do I fall short? That's a good thing to know and to keep in mind. Secondly, there is an age-old debate over where the locus of responsibility lies for sin. Is it societal? Is it personal? Is it the whole nature-nurture debate? Is there a public responsibility for our sin, or is it all private? James I don't think, is ignorant of the environmental factors that predispose us or lead us to various sins, our backgrounds, our environment that we live in. But James comes down very firmly in this passage on the side of personal responsibility. And this is a word we need to hear in our age. There's a pendulum that seems to swing back and forth when it comes to this topic. And the current trend is to focus on our external influences that lead us to sin. Psychology and counseling these days wants to explore how we were raised, how we've been treated in our life unfairly often, how we've been shaped by our environment. And once we've painted this picture of our environment that we grew up in, that we've been shaped by, then we tend to think that we've got a handle on our problems. This is why I do what I do, because my parents raised me in such a way, because my friends had these expectations of me, because of the school I went to, et cetera, et cetera. My problems come from the outside. All of these things are important. All of these things indeed had a hand in shaping who we are and leading us to be often tempted in the ways that we are tempted. All of these things are important. But James insists and demands that we look inside. You do not have an accurate account of your sin until you step up and take responsibility for it. You cannot get away from the personal responsibility that comes from our sin. And understanding this and grappling with this is the only path to health, perfection, and resisting temptations. It is these things, both outer and inner, that God is working in us to lead us to that perfection, wholeness, completion that he wants from us. And until we grapple with our own inner problems, our own personal responsibility for our sin, we will not arrive where we need to be. And we will not be able to resist temptation as we should. So once again, that is universally applicable to you. The taking of personal responsibility is not just something that your spouse and your friend need to do. It is something that you need to do. So keep yourself in mind as we're going through this passage. So with that, we'll end there, and we will pick up with verse 13 next time. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.